I'm happy to introduce Clara Lindstrom, who's doing her PhD these days, along with being a coordinator for CIIS events. I'm sorry, there's an official title for that. And she's going to talk about the body in all of this. I thought it was hilarious how Jamie was like, well, love, it's a feeling. Okay, Cosmology of Love conference is over. We're just going to go with that one. But then she said the body, and it comes at a very timely time. Those of you who have been surfing around on PCC chat, there's been a lot of discussion lately about technology and transhumanism and things like that, and the question has come up, what about the body? And in fact, that is in Clara's title, so she's going to tell us, what about the body in all of this? So, Clara Lindstrom.
So this is a short excerpt from a much longer article. I'm trying to squeeze a ton into a little bit of time, so it's going to be a wild ride. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to share the longer article afterwards, and I'll probably have to take questions during the break. So, it seems that everyone wants to talk about how digital and social media are affecting their lives. There are massive benefits mentioned as well as significant drawbacks. What I do not often see addressed, and what especially interests me, however, is the role of the body. We in the industrial growth society are plugged into electronic media and estranged from the natural world, which includes our own bodies, to a worrisome degree. While we forge ever more intimate bonds with our various electronic gadgets, and I just got an iPhone last week, our somatic connection to and relationship with the natural and biological world atrophies. This is a problem. In the midst of such a discussion, how does highlighting physical bodies change or affect the conversation's outcome? The reason I'm interested in this is because for a lot of my life I've had mild to severe chronic pain myself, so I've spent a bunch of time wishing that I didn't have to be in a body. Thus, my simple question, what about the body, is not just academic curiosity, but rather a desire to understand ontologically why we need to be embodied creatures. Or in terms of this conference, why must a cosmology of love include the physical? To clarify another point, digital media devices are not the enemy. I'm not advocating the abandonment of laptops, iPhones, and tablets. And I'm not interested in a set of narrow conclusions indicting these tools so much as I am in raising questions and introducing a new lens. People created these tools. The evolution of digital media technology has occurred within the context of a capitalist world economy and can be viewed in many ways as a response to its demands. Within this context, it's important to ask, why is faster better? Why is maximum efficiency assumed to be desirable? How is saving time related to saving money? When did time become monetized? I don't have space for a critique of global capitalism and its overarching role in fostering the media climate in which we find ourselves, although I wish I did. Rather, I will look at 4 ways the body is significant in discussing how these media are shaping our evolution. First, I'll introduce the notion of digital companion species. Second, what are some of the physical and psychological effects of relating to each other more through electronic media and less often body to body? Third, what happens in the physical environment around us when our attention is focused primarily on virtual rather than embodied spaces? And finally, how does our relationship to our own bodies inform our relationship to the natural world, and vice versa? So point 1, digital companion species. I spend more time with my computer than I do with any one of my closest friends. In fact, many of us have become so physically close to and emotionally dependent on our various devices that they are like our friends in a way. One might reasonably counter that they are merely the tools that connect us to our human community. But I would argue that the actual things we spend the bulk of our time interacting with have a huge impact on our thinking, emotions, and even our physiology. They serve as models and benchmarks for behavior. Now, this idea isn't novel. Back in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan famously said, "We shape our tools, and thereafter, our tools shape us." In order to get a sense for what this looks like, let me introduce a thought experiment. For millennia, and even post-Enlightenment to a great degree, our closest companions have been animals, plants, and other humans. Yes, we've been using cars and power tools and such for approximately 200 years, but the amount of time and the kind of intimate contact that we have with our digital tools today are arguably different. Listen to these figures from a 2010 Kaiser Family Foundation study. In 2010, U.S. adolescents spent an average of 8.5 hours per day interacting with digital devices. 30% of the time, they're simultaneously using more than one device, bringing the daily total exposure time to 11.5 hours. The pace of, quote, penetration, or the amount of time it takes for a new technology to be used by 50 million people, is unprecedented. For radio, technological penetration took 38 years. For telephone, 20 years. For television, 13 years. For the internet, 4. For Twitter, 3 years. iPads, 2 years. And for Google Plus, 88 days. So back to the thought experiment. As opposed to digital media, plants, animals, and humans operate in what I like to call biological time. In other words, they're examples of organic, or literally carbon-based, systems, wherein certain benchmark life events take given amounts of time that we humans don't have a lot of control over. Seeds take time to sprout and grow. Trees take years to become full size. Human gestation takes about 9 months, a process which I hope no one is trying to make 5 or 6 months. Could be, though. For most of human existence, our actions have been measured against processes unfolding in biological time. The point is, when our tablets, laptops, and cell phones become our closest companions, they become in many ways the beings after whom we consciously or unconsciously model our behavior. Our unconscious expectations of how long routine processes take, our ability to be patient and wait, and myriad other human behaviors that used to be linked up with other organic systems are now tacitly expected to operate in technological time. This may sound far-fetched, but let me give you an example, and I'm sure you can think of a bunch. I myself quite frequently find myself returning a phone call, writing an email, listening to online radio, and switching back and forth between internet browser windows of unrelated content all at the same time. A small computer would have no problem handling these tasks at once. So why does it leave me feeling jarred, irritated, and often vaguely inadequate? My felt sense in the moment is an exasperated, "What is wrong with me?" When in fact the standard against which I'm unconsciously measuring myself is humanly unattainable. I'm not living up to the capabilities of a computer. Point number 2. What happens when our bodies are largely left out of the communication equation and we relate to each other primarily through digital screens? Multiple studies have amassed data suggesting that the more digitally connected we become, in fact, the more isolated and unhappy we feel. These kinds of media are tricky because they give us a sense of being connected while allowing us to avoid the kind of intimacy that even superficial embodied contact fosters. A group of friends may be sitting together, for example, but eye contact and other kinds of body language can almost completely be avoided for stretches of time. What is lost when we increasingly miss out on opportunities to pick up visual and sensory cues from each other's bodies? How does this affect our understanding of one another as earthly creatures, embedded in and connected to a physical world? How does it affect our health? A 2010 study at University of Michigan compiled data from over 14,000 college students and found that, compared to the same cohort of 20 or 30 years ago, students today are about 40% lower in empathy, with the biggest drop occurring after 2000. Researchers pointed to the physical distance and anonymity of online interactions, citing the famous Milgram experiment, wherein individuals were given the chance to administer shocks to a person in another room. Milgram noted that when the person was physically distant, the victim's suffering possessed, quote, an abstract remote quality for the subject. He was aware, but only in a conceptual sense, that his actions caused pain to another person. The fact was apprehended but not felt. Scientists talk about the necessity of a multisensory environment. In other words, one that includes smell, touch, tone of voice, posture, facial expressions, etc., for honing empathy and observe. Because social interactions are so complex, we may need a number of different signals in combination to elicit compassion and motivate kindness. Many advances in media come at the expense of one or more of our senses, suggesting that one key feature of the techno-self is its continual evolution towards an abstract asensorality. Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill suggest that digital media use may have multi-generational effects on our species. She points out that the way we connect to others leaves a biological imprint on us. Put another way, we may think we are receiving identical information, whether we email, text, or converse with another face-to-face, but our bodies know the difference. Let me repeat that. We may think we are receiving identical information when we connect to others via text, email, or face-to-face, but our bodies know the difference. Our individual nervous systems are influenced and shaped by our interactions with others, and things like gesture, facial expression, and tone of voice play a huge role in this. Why does this have implications for the evolution of our species? Epigenetics has shown that learned behavior and experience in the form of epigenetic tags can be passed down from parent to child. Time constraints don't allow me to explain how that works here, it's in the article, but this is cause for concern when considering parents who are routinely more involved with their digital companions than they are with their offspring who share the same physical space with them. Their behavior not only has immediate consequences, it may also create environmental factors that leave traces on children's genetic structure. Clearly, parents who spend a few evenings unwinding with Facebook are not going to permanently damage their children. It is entirely possible to engage in digital pursuits and have healthy embodied relationships. But when the former begin to replace the latter, when real-time connections get sacrificed for screen time, it becomes problematic. Dr. Bruce Perry, a psychiatrist and children's mental health specialist, talks about neurological development in the first few years of life. It's during this time, as our brains are still rapidly developing, that we need to be physically touched and mirrored in order for our brains to develop the basic neurological capacity, or the wiring, for empathy. It turns out physical touch and body contact in infancy is foundational to our ability to empathize later in life. It is what sets the stage for the neurological capacity to have empathy. It is touch that, in concert with other factors, literally shapes us physiologically. Our infant brains respond to it and, in a complex back-and-forth dance, form neurons that then allow us to connect with others. Our limbic systems do a similar call-and response. Body contact prompts the wiring. All this time, we thought we were discrete, self-contained beings with our own biological and neurological development happening independent of the people around us. More and more, it looks like this is not the case. It appears the very matter in our bodies forms and is shaped by the kind of touch and attention we get from others when we are still infants, and on into later life. Point number 3, what happens in our bodies and environment around us as a result of our attention being plugged into virtual spaces? I invite you to consider the notion that the quality of being with digital media is quite different from that of being with natural or organic systems. Close your eyes for a second and imagine the felt sense in one's body when you're surfing between 8 different browser windows versus when you're sitting outside and watching a bird on a branch, for example. It's markedly different. All right, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip a section. Further, we have a hard time understanding or retaining information about a subject when our short-term memory's cognitive load, the information flowing into it, exceeds its ability to store and process. Our brains need downtime to function well. Scientists at UC San Francisco discovered that when rats engage in some new activity, their brains exhibit novel neurological patterns. But they're not able to process these patterns in a way that creates permanent learning unless they stop the activity. So in other words, downtime is to the brain what sleep is to the body. When was the last time you were at a cafe, in a waiting room, or standing in line, and did not see the vast majority of people around you relating nonstop to their digital companions? When do we allow our minds to wander? How often, when we have a quiet moment, do we stare thoughtfully into space? What used to be called zoning out now seems like a relic of the past, just when we're beginning to recognize it as a neurological necessity. I'd argue further that being absorbed in virtual space can lead to ignoring or even losing the ability to read signals from our own bodies. Our physical selves are fundamentally our most immediate, intimate examples of the natural world. A common response to repetitive strain or chronic physical pain is not empathy for a suffering body, it is annoyance or even anger. We perceive our bodies as having failed us, rather than listen to the brilliant warning system that has evolved over millions of years to alert us to the fact that something is gravely wrong. This is called blaming the victim. If we're this estranged from our bodies, our own little ecosystems, is it any wonder that we're out of sync with the natural world? If we lack the compassion to listen to the message conveyed by our own physical pain, how can we feel for trees, rivers, and soil? Perceptual psychologist Laura Sewell points out that our sensory capacities, taste, smell, sight, hearing, and touch, are the fundamental avenues of connection between self and world. When our lives are lived primarily through screens, these senses dull. Which brings us to point number 4. I'm going to try to do a synopsis. How does our relationship to our own bodies inform our relationship to the natural world? Humans need, for a wide array of reasons, to have meaningful embodied contact with nature. Nature deficit disorder, a term coined by Richard Louv in Last Child in the Woods, has been taken up as a convenient way to refer to this concept. But while the terminology may be new, the body of work supporting it isn't. In fact, the notion that our bodies are not nature, in the sense that most people conceive of the term, is a modern idea. Only in recent history has the natural world been out there, and human bodies somehow separate from it. Ecopsychology holds that the human psyche is embedded in and inseparable from the natural world. It takes for granted the human-nature connection, and in fact goes beyond it by dismantling the artificial binary between humans and nature. It honors the truth of teachings like Jeanette Armstrong's in Keepers of the Earth. Love this. Okinawans teach that the body is the earth itself. They say that our flesh, blood, and bones are earth body. In all cycles in which the earth moves, so does our body. As Okinawans, we say our body is sacred. It is the core of our being, which permits the rest of self to be. Our word for body literally means the land-dreaming capacity. There's an unconscious connection between how we conceive of and treat our own bodies and how we understand and treat the natural world, and vice versa. If we lose a sense of rootedness in our embodied selves and spend an increasing amount of time in digital realms, if we routinely eschew body-to-body connections in favor of relationships played out via digital screens, if we ignore and denigrate our bodies for sending us distress signals from biological time, more importantly, if we teach our children these behaviors, we will be walking down a road of increasing environmental illness and alienation. So, there are no easy answers. It would be facile to suggest that a few behavior changes adopted by one individual could somehow save that person from the ills that I've described. Because if we've learned anything, it's that we are fundamentally connected to each other. And the social and cultural spaces that we create together will affect each and every one of us, right down to our blood, bones, and neurons. Perhaps, as philosopher Derek Jensen says, before the right answers can emerge, we have to create spaces in which the right questions can bubble up. This requires living in biological time, slowing down, listening, and attending. He says, I don't always know what the right questions are. I only know that they reside in my body, and that in order to discover them, or better, remember, I need to be still. Doing so can allow us to reconnect to ourselves, the natural world, and each other. This is my vision for a cosmology of love. 20 minutes.
Well, that was such a beautiful and rich and timely and well-articulated talk that I don't want to just leave you hanging. I want to leave time for at least a couple questions, even though we might go a little bit into the break, but I think it's worth it. Unless there are none, in which case, oh, there's one.
I really enjoyed that.
Thank
you. Something occurred to me that was really interesting, and I'm wondering if this is something anyone else can relate to. I don't as much see my lack of empathy online, and it might be the generation that I'm a part of, but I see it with cars, big time. And so it's still in line with that same concepts, but just like I can't always see that it's a human with a body and have as much empathy for them. I get road rage. And I was just curious if that came up in what you were looking at.
Yeah, empathy is a big one. I mean, we were just having a discussion on PCC chat about it, and so there's been a lot of arguments, and Jeremy Rifkin, for example, talks about the expansion of empathy and how, knowing about people in other countries, an earthquake or a disaster hits, and you can have empathy for people halfway around the world who you've never met. So in a sense, it's an evolution of empathy or expression of empathy. But on the foundational level, I guess what I find interesting is that if you don't have the physical touch, embodied contact in the immediate environment at the get-go, like in infancy, you need an actual local physical source of touch and mirroring to create the neurological capacity that then will allow you to expand your empathy out into the world. So I think a lot of times people forget about that initial laying down of the groundwork, and it's just like, oh, we can feel for people we've never met in Russia now. So it's kind of it's almost two sides of a coin.
So brilliant, and we share this impassioned stance and attempt at integration. I appreciate your point that it's not about abandoning technology, which would be impossible, but how to be in right relationship with it. And what comes up for me as somebody who's experimented with a lot and really identified the neurochemical evidence of addiction, especially with Facebook and social networking, and how it's just extraordinarily activating of the dopaminergic system, the pleasure center, and the seeking drive in us evolutionarily.
Right.
And being off of that, I say like a drug for almost a year last year. And what pulls me back and where I feel like I don't think I can ever leave entirely is that it's really digitized tribe, right? So at the DNA indigenous level, we desperately need to be in tribal engagement on a daily basis. And with the escalation of individualism and mobilization across the developed world, we're alone the majority of the time, except for our digital companions through which we access the tribe, right? That is now dispersed all over the country and all over the world. So do you have any suggestions like how to optimally honor the fact that is keeping keeping us in touch with each other in a way that's unprecedented and compensatory, but also is not, is having these detrimental effects as well?
No, I know completely. Like I said, I got a smartphone last week for the first time, and I'm like, wow, I can see why people are on these all the time. I agree. I mean, when I finished writing this article and like doing all the research and whatever, I came to the end and I was like, wow, I could now write the opposite article. In a sense. I mean, as far as like, wow, here's a marginalized person in the middle of, Kansas who doesn't have any queer community, and like now they go online and they find a whole bunch of community, or, the Arab uprisings, Arab Spring, or people meeting each other who then spend the rest of their lives together. I mean, there's tons. So yes, it's so layered and complex. It's like we're always seeking sort of one magic pill, like either do it or don't, either have this or that or don't. But it's just a continual layered negotiating. I found personally that I feel so much better in myself when I'm not online in the evening at home. I feel like, after you've been surfing for a long time, you kind of go back and you're checking. It's like opening the fridge to see if there's new food. You sort of just feel like you ate a whole cheesecake. You're like, oh God, I'm not nourished. You're just like, oh, I feel yucky, as opposed to, and it was amazing how when I got offline in the evening at my house, like all these things that hadn't gotten done, like the earrings I wanted to repair, or the thing I wanted to sew, or that person I never called back. I'm like, wow, suddenly I have all this time. It's crazy. I didn't think I was filling that much time before, but it's amazing how, so it's super complex. And like I say, every time I came up with an example of like how it was problematic, I was like, and then it's also helpful in this other way. But I think it's just important to think, and I guess what really started to stick out for me was that the primary necessary need for local embodied physical contact before, especially in the developing years, before you can then have the capacity to go out and have these larger extended relationships.
Claire, we have to move on. I want to thank you for that wonderful talk, and I also want to thank you